The storm bore down on Atlanta like a living force, sheets of rain slamming against the patrol car as if trying to drive it off the road. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the city's industrial district in stark, jagged flashes. Sarah Collins gripped the wheel tighter, her sharp green eyes scanning the road ahead. Her breath was steady, but her pulse hammered in her ears. Beside her, Max sat upright, his amber eyes locked on the windshield, his ears swiveling with every crack of thunder. The radio crackled to life again. Possible abduction, Warehouse 42, Industrial District. Suspects armed and dangerous. Backup is en route. ETA 15 minutes. Proceed with extreme caution. 15 minutes. They didn't have 15 minutes. Sarah keyed her mic. Copy that. Unit K9 responding. ETA 3 minutes. Max let out a low, determined growl, his body leaning forward as if he understood every word. Sarah glanced at him briefly through the rearview mirror, her lips pressing into a grim line. "Just another night, partner," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "We've got this." As they turned onto the desolate industrial road, the streetlights flickered, their faint, erratic glow barely cutting through the storm. Warehouse 42 loomed ahead, a massive, rusted skeleton of a building. Its windows were broken, jagged glass jutting out like teeth. A faint glow seeped through the cracks of the structure, revealing movement inside. Sarah killed the headlights and parked a block away. Rain pounded against the windshield, drowning out everything but the drumbeat of her heart. She unbuckled her seatbelt, her fingers brushing over Max's harness. "You ready, boy?" she asked. Max answered with a quiet bark, his tail giving a single thump. His body was tense, his every muscle coiled like a spring. He was ready. He was always ready. The two of them moved silently through the downpour, the sound of the rain masking their approach. The air was thick with the acrid scent of oil and mildew. Sarah pressed her back against the side of the warehouse, peering through a crack in the rusted metal door. Inside, 3 figures moved in the dim light of flashlights. One paced nervously, his hand resting on a weapon. The second was arguing with someone out of view. The third stood motionless in the corner, their shadow blending with the darkness. Sarah's stomach twisted. She couldn't see the victim. Were they even still alive? Max growled low beside her, his head dipping as he scented the air. The hair along his spine bristled. Sarah placed a steadying hand on him, her fingers brushing his damp fur. "I feel it too," she whispered. Her instinct screamed that something was wrong, more wrong than usual. She signaled Max to stay close and pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The metal groaned faintly, the sound swallowed by the relentless storm. The interior was worse than she imagined. The air was suffocating, heavy with the metallic tang of rust and something fouler, blood. Every step she took was deliberate, her boots silent against the slick concrete floor. Max moved like a shadow beside her, his body low, his ears pinned back. His sharp eyes darted around the room, searching for movement, for threats. Then he froze. His nose twitched and his tail stiffened. He growled again, the sound so low it was almost imperceptible. Sarah stopped in her tracks. "What is it?" she murmured. Max stared ahead, his gaze locked on a stack of crates in the far corner of the room. Before she could investigate, the warehouse exploded into chaos. A deafening boom shattered the stillness, the flash of an explosion blinding her as debris rained down. The force of the blast threw Sarah off her feet, her body slamming into the cold, hard ground. Pain shot through her ribs as her head spun. She coughed, choking on the acrid smoke that filled the air. "Max!" she screamed, her voice hoarse, desperate. Through the thick haze of smoke and falling rubble, she saw him. Max was scrambling toward her, his paws slipping on the debris. His barking was frantic, his eyes wild with panic. But a jagged wall of twisted metal and rubble had collapsed between them, cutting him off. "Max, no!" Sarah shouted, trying to push herself up, but her body refused to obey. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain shooting through her side. She could see the terror in Max's eyes, the way he clawed at the debris, trying to reach her. "Go!" she yelled, her voice breaking. "Get help!" Max froze, his entire body trembling. He didn't want to leave. His amber eyes met hers, and for a moment it was as if they were having a silent conversation. "Go, Max!" she shouted again, tears stinging her eyes. "You have to go!" With a heart-wrenching whimper, Max turned and bolted toward the shattered doorway, his paws pounding against the ground as he disappeared into the storm. The smoke grew thicker, choking her as she tried to pull herself forward. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate. A flashlight beam cut through the haze, landing on her prone figure. The shadow of a man loomed over her, his face obscured, but his intent clear. Sarah's vision blurred, her strength fading. The last thing she heard was Max's fading bark, a desperate echo swallowed by the storm. Then darkness claimed her. The rain showed no mercy as Max tore through the streets, his paws splashing through puddles and mud. His sleek coat was soaked, droplets flying off him as he pushed forward with unrelenting determination. Every step was a battle against exhaustion, but his mind held one singular focus: Sarah. The city's streets were eerily quiet, the storm having driven most people indoors. Max weaved between abandoned cars and trash bins, his nose working overtime. Every scent he picked up felt wrong, old, stale, useless. He needed something sharper, something that would lead him back to her. His heart raced as the familiar neon lights of the precinct came into view. Max's body gave out just as he reached the station doors. He collapsed onto the wet pavement, his chest heaving as he barked weakly, each sound fading into the roar of the storm. The officers inside barely had time to react before the doors swung open and Max stumbled into the bright fluorescent light, his paws leaving muddy smears on the polished floor. "Max!" Officer Davis, a young recruit, was the first to rush to the soaked, panting dog. "What's wrong, boy? Where's Sarah?" Max barked again, his body trembling as he struggled to stand. Davis crouched down, his hands moving over the harness that was scratched and smeared with soot. That's when he found it, a small, blood-stained note wedged into one of the harness straps. "What the?" Davis's brow furrowed as he pulled it free and unfolded the damp paper. Scrawled in Sarah's unmistakable handwriting were a series of numbers, coordinates. Captain Harris, a grizzled veteran with decades of service, approached, his expression grim. He took the note from Davis and examined it. "Coordinates," he muttered. "Looks like she was trying to send us a message." Max barked sharply, his energy briefly reigniting. He lunged toward the door, clawing at it, his amber eyes pleading. Harris crouched down, his face inches from Max's. "You're trying to lead us, aren't you?" The dog's bark was answer enough. Harris stood, barking orders to the officers nearby. "Gear up. We're moving now. Max is our only lead, and we're not wasting any more time." As the team scrambled, Max paced in tight circles, his frustration palpable. The weight was unbearable. When the officers finally loaded into their vehicles, Max leapt into the lead car without hesitation, taking his place beside Harris. The convoy cut through the storm, the red and blue lights of the squad cars slicing through the darkness. Max sat rigid, his nose pressed against the window as the city gave way to empty roads and dense woods. The coordinates pointed to an isolated area far from the city, a place where no one would hear screams for help. Harris glanced at Max. "You better be right, boy." The car skidded to a halt near the edge of a forest. The rain had turned the dirt path into a river of mud, making it impossible to drive any further. The officers piled out, their boots sinking into the muck as they armed themselves. Max jumped out last, his legs trembling but his spirit unbroken. He barked once, then darted ahead, his nose close to the ground. The team followed, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness as they trailed the determined dog. Max moved like a creature possessed, weaving through the trees, his senses sharper than ever. Then suddenly he stopped, his ears pinned back and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Harris raised a fist, signaling the team to halt. "What is it, Max?" he whispered. Max lunged forward, leading them to a cluster of trees where something was caught in the branches. Harris shone his flashlight on the object, a torn piece of fabric, Sarah's jacket. "Damn," Harris muttered, his throat tight. He crouched to examine it, the realization dawning that Sarah had been here, and she was hurt. She's alive. She's leaving us a trail. Max barked, breaking Harris's thoughts, and took off again, this time faster. The team struggled to keep up as the dog's desperation grew. He led them deeper into the woods until the faint glow of a light appeared through the trees. "Eyes up!" Harris barked. "Weapons ready!" The team moved in formation, their movements cautious as they approached what appeared to be a makeshift campsite. A fire burned low, barely illuminating the figures huddled around it. Max froze, his body low, his growl soft but deadly. Harris raised his weapon. "Police! Hands where I can see them!" The figures scattered like cockroaches, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The officers pursued, but Max didn't follow. Instead, he darted toward the remnants of the camp, his nose leading him to a patch of disturbed earth. He sniffed frantically, pawing at the ground until he uncovered a small, blood-stained scarf. It was Sarah's. Max whimpered, nudging the fabric with his nose. Harris approached, his heart sinking at the sight. "She's close," he said, his voice more to himself than anyone else. He knelt down, placing a hand on Max's head. "You've done good, boy. We'll find her." Max looked up at Harris, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and urgency. Then, as if renewed by the faintest scent of Sarah lingering in the air, he barked and took off again, his body disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Harris didn't hesitate. "Let's move. Max knows the way." As the officers followed the dog into the night, the storm began to break, but the tension only grew heavier. Somewhere in the darkness, Sarah was waiting. Max wouldn't stop until he found her. Rain hammered against the city, drowning every sound but Max's heavy breaths and the splash of his paws against the slick pavement. His vision was blurred by the storm, his body trembling from exhaustion, but he didn't stop. The weight of his mission, the memory of Sarah's desperate command, pushed him forward. The precinct came into view, its bright lights spilling onto the street like a beacon. With the last ounce of his strength, Max stumbled up the steps, his claws scraping against the concrete. His soaked, mud-streaked form crashed through the doors, startling the officers inside. "Max!" Officer Davis, a young rookie, was the first to react. He rushed over, dropping to his knees beside the dog. "Where's Sarah? What happened?" Max barked sharply, his body trembling. His eyes darted to Davis, then to the door, as though begging him to understand. Davis reached for the dog's harness and froze when he noticed the blood-stained scrap of paper tucked into one of the straps. "Captain," Davis called, his voice urgent as he pulled the note free. Captain Harris, the commanding officer, strode over. His weathered face, lined by decades of service, was grim as he unfolded the damp paper. The ink was smudged, but the message was clear. Coordinates, hastily scrawled in Sarah's handwriting. "Coordinates," Harris murmured, his jaw tightening. He looked at Max, who was struggling to stand, his body sagging under the weight of exhaustion. "This dog's been through hell, and he's still trying to lead us." Max barked again, pawing weakly at the door. Harris crouched, meeting the dog's intense amber eyes. "You're not giving up, are you, boy?" Max's bark was all the answer he needed. The storm had not relented as the convoy of police vehicles sped toward the coordinates. Inside the lead car, Max sat upright in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on the road. Harris drove in silence, glancing at the dog every so often. It was hard to ignore the urgency in Max's body language, the way he leaned forward, his ears twitching at every sound. "We're coming, Sarah," Harris muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The coordinates led them to the outskirts of the city, where the paved roads gave way to muddy trails and dense forest. The cars screeched to a halt as the path became too treacherous to drive further. Flashlights clicked on, beams of light slicing through the darkness as the officers stepped out into the rain. Max jumped down from the car, landing heavily, but regaining his footing quickly. He sniffed the air, then the ground, and started forward without hesitation. The officers followed, their boots squelching in the mud. Harris watched the dog lead the way. "Stay close to him," he ordered. "He knows where we need to go." The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and sound, the storm masking every clue except for what Max could smell. He moved with purpose, his nose to the ground, his tail stiff with concentration. Then suddenly, he stopped. Harris and the officers froze behind him. Max's ears pricked and his body lowered, his growl barely audible over the storm. Harris stepped closer, his flashlight sweeping the area. It landed on a patch of disturbed ground near the base of a tree. Something glinted in the beam of light. Max lunged forward, pawing at the earth until he uncovered a small object. Harris knelt down and picked it up, a battered silver badge. Sarah's badge. The captain's throat tightened. He ran his thumb over the engraved number, his mind racing. "She's been here," he said, his voice rough. "She dropped this for us to find." Max let out a sharp bark and darted forward again, his pace quickening as if the discovery had reignited his energy. Harris scrambled to his feet, shouting over his shoulder, "Let's move! She's close!" The team pressed on, the rain now a distant hum against the pounding of their boots and the roaring of their hearts. Max led them to a narrow clearing where the remnants of a hastily abandoned camp came into view. A smoldering fire sent thin tendrils of smoke into the air, and scattered supplies lay strewn across the wet ground. Max didn't hesitate. He ran straight to a pile of tarps and began sniffing furiously. Harris caught up to him, his flashlight revealing bloodstains on the fabric. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He crouched, placing a hand on Max's head. "Good boy," he whispered. "We'll find her." Max barked sharply, his tail wagging once, before he took off again. This time his pace was frantic, as though he could sense that Sarah's time was running out. Harris followed, his voice echoing through the storm. "Don't lose him. He's our best shot." They followed Max deeper into the forest, their breaths heavy and their nerves stretched taut. The storm had eased, but the darkness remained oppressive. Suddenly, Max stopped again, his ears swiveling forward. He growled, a deep, threatening sound, and crouched low. Ahead, faint voices carried through the trees. Harris raised his fist, signaling the team to halt. He stepped forward cautiously, his flashlight off, relying on the faint glow of the clearing ahead to guide him. Through the shadows, he could see movement. Figures, 3 of them, standing near what appeared to be a makeshift cage. Max growled again, louder this time, and Harris knew they were out of time. He motioned to the others, his voice low. "On my mark." Before he could give the signal, Max lunged forward with a ferocious bark, breaking through the underbrush and charging toward the figures. Chaos erupted as the officers surged after him, shouts and commands cutting through the night. Harris followed closely, his heart pounding. As the scene unfolded before him, he caught a glimpse of Sarah's battered form inside the cage, her face pale but her eyes wide with determination. She locked eyes with Max, a flicker of hope breaking through her exhaustion. Max reached the cage, his body pressed against the bars as he barked frantically. Harris pushed forward, his weapon raised, shouting for the suspects to surrender. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time it felt winnable, and Max, unwavering, would see it through to the end. The chaos in the clearing was deafening, shouts, barks, and the clatter of hurried footsteps blending into the night. Max stood pressed against the bars of the cage, his bark relentless, his amber eyes locked on Sarah's pale face. Her lips moved faintly, too quiet to hear, but her expression was unmistakable. "Keep going." Captain Harris and the team fanned out, their weapons drawn. 2 suspects bolted into the forest, but the third, a stocky man with a rifle, stood his ground. Harris didn't flinch. "Drop the weapon!" he roared. The man hesitated, his knuckles white on the rifle's grip, but before he could make his decision, Max's growl cut through the tension like a blade. The man turned toward the dog, his weapon shifting, but it was all the opening Harris needed. A precise shot hit the rifle, knocking it from the man's hands. The officers surged forward, subduing him in moments. Harris barely spared him a glance. His focus was on Sarah, slumped in the cage, her breath shallow. Max pawed at the bars, whining now, his usual composure cracking under the weight of her condition. "Get those bolt cutters," Harris barked. An officer rushed forward, and with a few metallic snaps, the cage door was wrenched open. Max was inside before anyone else could move, his body pressing against Sarah as he nuzzled her neck. Her hand trembled as it rose, weakly stroking his fur. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I knew you'd come." Harris knelt beside her, his rough hands checking for injuries. Her uniform was torn, her arms and face smeared with dirt and blood, but her pulse was steady. Relief washed over him, though his tone stayed firm. "We've got you, Collins. You're safe now." Sarah blinked up at him, her gaze darting to Max. Not without him. Harris gave a rare smile. He wasn't going to let that happen. The ride back to the precinct was quiet. Sarah sat in the back of the van, wrapped in a blanket, her head resting against the cool metal wall. Max sat at her feet, his body pressed protectively against her legs. Every so often, she would reach down, her fingers brushing his fur, as if to reassure herself that he was still there. The rhythmic hum of the tires and the patter of rain on the roof seemed to lull everyone into silence, but Sarah's mind was restless. Every bump in the road brought flashes of memory, not just of the night's horrors, but of moments long past, moments that had shaped her partnership with Max. 2 years earlier, a younger, less experienced Sarah stood in the K9 training facility, her arms crossed as she watched a lean, wiry dog pace inside his enclosure. The trainers had warned her about Max. Too unpredictable, they'd said, too stubborn. But Sarah saw something different. His movements were sharp and precise, his focus intense, even in his frustration. He wasn't undisciplined. He was waiting for someone who understood him. "Let me take him," she'd told the lead trainer. He'd raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Collins, that dog's not for beginners." "Good thing I'm not one," she'd replied, her tone unyielding. The first few weeks had been grueling. Max tested her patience at every turn, refusing commands, challenging her authority. But Sarah never gave up. She met his stubbornness with her own, and slowly their bond began to form. She learned his quirks, the way his ears twitched when he was nervous, the soft growl he made when he was curious. The breakthrough came during a simulated search and rescue drill. The other dogs followed their handler's instructions to the letter, but Max had deviated, ignoring her commands to check a pile of rubble. Frustrated, she'd almost called him back until his bark cut through the air. He'd found the target, buried deeper than anyone expected. From that moment, Sarah stopped trying to make Max fit the mold. Instead, she worked with his instincts, trusting his judgment as much as her own. They became a team, each move synchronized, each decision made as one. The sound of the van's brakes jolted Sarah from her memories. The vehicle had stopped outside the precinct, the storm finally reduced to a drizzle. Harris opened the door, offering her a steadying hand. "Let's get you checked out." Sarah stepped down carefully, Max immediately at her side. The medics approached, their faces lined with concern, but Sarah waved them off for a moment. She knelt beside Max, taking his face in her hands. "You saved me, Max," she said softly. Her voice wavered, but her gaze was steady. "I don't know how, but you always do." Max licked her hand, his tail giving a slow wag. It was the first sign of relief she'd seen from him all night. Harris cleared his throat, his tone gruff but kind. "He didn't do it alone. You trained him to be the best. Don't forget that." Sarah nodded, rising to her feet. "I won't." Later, in the quiet of the precinct, Sarah sat in the observation room with Max lying at her feet. The suspects had been interrogated, and the victim they'd rescued, a young woman barely out of her teens, was receiving care. Justice was being served, but Sarah couldn't shake the weight in her chest. "Hey!" Harris's voice broke the silence as he entered, holding 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of her before taking a seat. "You did good out there." Sarah shook her head, her fingers tracing the edge of the cup. "I froze, Harris. For a moment back there, I thought it was over." "And yet here you are," Harris replied, his tone firm. "You and that dog pulled through. You've been through worse and you'll keep going." Sarah glanced down at Max, who had dozed off, His body finally relaxed. "He's the reason I'm here. He never stopped." Harris smiled faintly. "That's because he knows who you are. Just don't forget it yourself." The night ended with Sarah and Max walking out into the cool, damp air. The storm had passed, leaving the city quiet. Sarah looked down at her partner, her hand resting on his head. "Ready to go home, boy?" she asked. Max wagged his tail, and together they disappeared into the night, ready for whatever came next. The precinct was quieter than usual, the hum of fluorescent lights a soft backdrop to the tension in the air. Sarah sat in the break room, her uniform freshly cleaned, but still bearing faint traces of the night's ordeal. Max lay at her feet, his ears occasionally flicking, as though still on alert even in rest. His eyes remained half open, ever watchful. Sarah sipped her coffee, the bitter taste grounding her. The weight of the day hung heavy on her shoulders, and every quiet moment brought flashes of the cage, the cold steel bars, and Max's frantic barking. She reached down to stroke his fur, finding comfort in the warmth beneath her hand. Max glanced up at her, his amber eyes calm but knowing. "You always know, don't you?" she murmured, "even when I'm falling apart." Max gave a soft huff, his tail wagging faintly. It was his way of reassuring her, just as he'd done countless times before. Sarah leaned back, exhaling deeply. But the reprieve was short-lived. The door creaked open, and Captain Harris stepped inside, his expression grim. "Collins, we need to talk." Sarah straightened, her heart quickening. "What's wrong?" Harris gestured for her to follow, and Sarah stood, Max immediately rising to his feet. They followed Harris to the operations room, where a map of the surrounding area was spread across the table. Red markers dotted various locations, but one in particular had been circled multiple times. "This isn't over," Harris said, pointing to the map. "The suspects we apprehended were only part of the operation. We have intel suggesting a larger group is using another site outside the city, likely a hub for trafficking." Sarah's stomach tightened. "Do we know where?" "Not yet," Harris admitted, "but we've narrowed it down to a 10-mile radius near the outskirts. It's remote, heavily wooded, perfect for staying off the grid." Max growled softly, his ears perking up as though he understood the gravity of the situation. Harris glanced at the dog, then back at Sarah. "We need him," he said simply. "No one else can track like Max." Sarah hesitated, her hand instinctively finding Max's harness. The thought of sending him back into danger so soon after their ordeal made her chest tighten, but she knew there was no other option. Max was their best chance, and if there were more victims out there, they couldn't waste time. "When do we leave?" she asked. The drive to the search area was tense. The convoy moved quietly through winding roads, the darkness outside thick and oppressive. Max sat beside Sarah, his nose twitching as he took in the faint scents carried through the cracked window. Sarah rested her hand on his back, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Sarah," Harris's voice came through the radio. "You good back there?" She picked up the receiver. "We're ready." "Copy that," Harris replied. "This one's going to be tricky. Stay sharp." The vehicles came to a halt at the edge of the forest. The search area was vast, the terrain rugged and unpredictable. Flashlights clicked on, beams slicing through the darkness as the officers fanned out. Max stepped out of the car, his body instantly alert. He sniffed the air, his tail stiffening as he caught a faint trail. Sarah crouched beside him, her voice calm but firm. "What do you have, Max?" "Show me." Max moved forward, his nose close to the ground as he began to track. The team followed, their movements careful as they navigated the uneven terrain. The rain from earlier had softened the ground, leaving behind a layer of mud that muffled their footsteps but made it easier to spot tracks. They didn't have to wait long. "Over here!" An officer called, his flashlight illuminating a discarded piece of rope tangled in the underbrush. Harris picked it up, his expression darkening. "Looks fresh. We're on the right track." Max barked, his body pulling toward a denser part of the forest. Sarah tightened her grip on his leash, her heart racing as they pressed forward. The trees grew closer together, their gnarled branches creating a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Every sound seemed amplified. the crunch of boots on leaves, the distant rustle of wind through the trees. Then Max stopped abruptly, his ears pinned back, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. Sarah froze, her hand instinctively moving to her holster. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Max didn't respond, his gaze fixed ahead. Sarah followed his line of sight, her flashlight sweeping the area until it landed on a faint outline. A cabin, barely visible through the thick foliage. The windows were dark, but the faint flicker of movement inside betrayed its occupancy. Sarah keyed her radio. "Harris, we've got something. Looks like a structure about 50 yards ahead." "Hold your position," Harris ordered. "We're moving in." The team regrouped quickly, their weapons drawn as they approached the cabin. Max stayed at Sarah's side, his growl growing louder with each step. The officers spread out, taking up positions around the perimeter. Harris signaled to Sarah, and she nodded, moving to the door. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the handle. Max pressed against her leg, his warmth grounding her. She took a deep breath, then pushed the door open. The room inside was small and cluttered, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting a harsh, flickering light. Two men sat at a table, their faces contorted in surprise as the door burst open. One of them reached for a weapon, but Max was faster. He lunged, his teeth bared, and the man froze, his hand stopping inches from the gun. "Hands where I can see them," Sarah commanded, her voice steady. The men complied, their expressions shifting from anger to fear. Harris entered behind her, his team quickly securing the suspects. Sarah's focus, however, was on the far corner of the room, where a small trapdoor lay partially open. Max sniffed the air, then moved toward the door, his tail stiffening. Sarah followed, her heart pounding as she knelt to lift it. The faint sound of muffled cries reached her ears, sending a chill down her spine. "It's them," she said, her voice breaking. "We found them." Harris joined her, his face hard but triumphant. "Let's get them out." As the officers worked to free the victims hidden below, Sarah sat back on her heels, her hand resting on Max's head. He looked up at her, his amber eyes filled with an emotion she could only describe as pride. "You did it, Max," she whispered. "You always do." The quiet sobs of the rescued victims filled the cramped cabin, cutting through the tense silence that followed the raid. Sarah knelt by the trapdoor, helping a trembling young girl climb out. The girl couldn't have been older than 16, her face pale and streaked with dirt, her hands clutching at Sarah's jacket like it was a lifeline. "It's okay," Sarah said softly, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "You're safe now." Max stood beside her, his sharp eyes scanning the room, his ears twitching at every faint sound. Even in the apparent safety of the moment, his posture remained rigid, ready for the next threat. And it wasn't long before it came. A deafening crack shattered the air, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Sarah reacted instantly, throwing herself over the girl to shield her. Max let out a sharp bark, his body snapping toward the noise. Harris's voice boomed over the commotion. "They're outside! Defensive positions now!" Chaos erupted as the officers scrambled to secure the cabin. The suspects, realizing their time was up, had rallied reinforcements, and gunfire erupted from the surrounding trees. Sarah's heart raced as she guided the victims toward the relative safety of the far wall. "Stay down," she ordered, her voice cutting through the din. Max barked again, low and guttural, his body trembling with restrained energy. Sarah placed a hand on his harness, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her. "Not yet, boy. Stay with me." Outside, the storm that had eased earlier began to rumble back to life. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the dense forest where shadowy figures moved between the trees. Harris crouched near the cabin's shattered window, his weapon raised. "They're trying to flank us," he muttered into his radio. "Collins, status on the civilians?" "Secure," Sarah replied, her eyes darting toward Max. His ears were pinned back, his teeth bared as he growled toward the door. She knew what he wanted, to act, to protect, to end the threat, but she also knew the risk. A second shot rang out, Closer this time, splintering the wooden frame of the cabin. Max lunged toward the door, barking furiously. Sarah grabbed his harness, pulling him back. "Wait!" she said firmly. He snarled in frustration, his muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. Harris's voice crackled over the radio. "Collins, we're losing the perimeter. We need to push back." Sarah looked down at Max, her hand still gripping his harness. He met her gaze, his amber eyes burning with resolve. She nodded, her voice soft but commanding. "Go!" Max bolted, a streak of muscle and determination as he darted through the door and into the chaos outside. The officers knew to watch for him, their movements shifting to provide cover as the dog moved with precision. Sarah followed, her weapon raised, her heart hammering in her chest. Outside, the forest had become a battlefield. The attackers moved like ghosts, their positions obscured by the trees and undergrowth. But Max had no trouble finding them. His powerful nose led him to the nearest figure, and before the man could react, Max lunged, his teeth sinking into the suspect's arm. The man cried out, dropping his weapon as Max held firm, his growl echoing through the trees. Sarah was right behind him. She aimed her weapon, her voice sharp and unwavering. "Don't move!" The man froze, his face twisted in pain and fear. Another officer rushed in to secure him as Sarah turned her attention back to Max. "Good boy," she said, her voice tight with adrenaline. "Keep going." Max didn't hesitate. He tore through the undergrowth, his keen senses leading him to the next threat. Sarah followed as best she could, her breath coming in short bursts. Every shout, every gunshot was a reminder of how close they were to losing control. Then she saw him. Another suspect raising a rifle, his target clear. "Max!" Sarah shouted, her voice a desperate command. Max turned sharply, his body twisting in midair as the gunman fired. The shot missed by inches, and Max was on him before the man could fire again. The rifle fell to the ground as Max pinned the attacker, his growl low and menacing. Sarah closed the distance, her weapon trained on the man. "Hands where I can see them!" she barked. The man complied, trembling as officers moved in to secure him. As the final shots rang out, the forest fell into an uneasy silence. The attackers had been subdued, their reinforcements neutralized. The officers regrouped, their breaths heavy, their bodies tense with the lingering effects of adrenaline. Max returned to Sarah's side, his chest heaving, his fur matted with mud and sweat. Sarah knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she ran them over his body, checking for injuries. "You're okay," she murmured, her voice thick with relief. "You're okay." Max licked her hand, his tail wagging faintly. Despite the chaos, despite the danger, he was unshaken. He had done his job. Harris approached, his face grim but triumphant. "We've secured the area," he said. "Everyone's accounted for." Sarah nodded, her hand still resting on Max's back. "What about the victims?" "Safe," Harris replied, "thanks to you and him." The team made their way back to the cabin, where the rescued victims were being loaded into vehicles. Sarah watched as the young girl she'd shielded earlier was helped into an ambulance, her tear-streaked face lighting up when she saw Max. "Thank you," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah smiled, her throat tight as she gave a small nod. As the vehicles pulled away, the storm finally broke, the clouds parting to reveal the faint glow of dawn. Sarah looked down at Max, his tired but resolute gaze meeting hers. "You saved them," she said softly. "You saved me." Max leaned against her, his weight solid and reassuring. Together they stood in the clearing, the forest around them quiet once more. The dawn broke over the city of Atlanta, painting the horizon in hues of gold and pink. The storm had passed, leaving the streets wet and shimmering under the soft light. The convoy of police vehicles moved steadily through the quiet streets, their mission complete. In the lead car, Sarah sat in silence, her hand resting on Max's head. The rhythmic rise and fall of his breaths told her he was finally allowing himself a moment of rest. The events of the night played over and over in her mind. The gunfire, the desperate cries, the sight of Max fearlessly charging into danger, all of it felt surreal now. She glanced at him, his sleek coat still damp, his harness slightly frayed. He had faced unimaginable danger without hesitation, not for glory or recognition, but because that was who he was. "You're a hero, you know that?" she said softly. Max didn't stir, but the faint wag of his tail told her he heard. Back at the precinct, the mood was somber, but triumphant. Officers moved with purpose, filing reports and debriefing after the operation. Sarah carried Max into the break room, where she set him gently on a blanket near the heater. His eyes fluttered open briefly, meeting hers before closing again, his body giving in to exhaustion. Harris entered, a cup of coffee in hand. He set it on the table in front of her, pulling up a chair. His usually gruff demeanor softened as he regarded her. "How's the mutt?" he asked, nodding toward Max. Sarah smiled faintly. "Exhausted, but he'll be okay. He always is." Harris leaned back in his chair, the lines on his face deepening. "He's got something most of us don't. That dog doesn't quit, no matter what." "He's more than a dog," Sarah replied, her voice quiet but firm. "He's everything." Harris didn't argue. Instead, he studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You did good out there, Collins. Both of you." Later that morning, Sarah and Max finally left the precinct. The city was waking up, the hum of traffic and chatter slowly filling the air. Sarah unlocked her car, and Max leapt into the passenger seat with a grace that seemed impossible for how tired he must have been. She laughed softly, shaking her head as she slid into the driver's seat. "You don't even need me to open the door for you anymore, huh?" she teased. Max wagged his tail, his eyes bright with affection. As they drove, the familiar streets of Atlanta passed by in a blur. The exhaustion Sarah had been holding at bay began to creep in, her limbs heavy, her mind foggy. But the sight of Max beside her, his head resting on the door, brought her a sense of peace she couldn't explain. The car pulled into her driveway, the modest brick house standing quietly beneath the glow of the morning sun. Sarah stepped out, stretching before opening the door for Max. He hopped out, his energy seemingly renewed by the sight of home. Inside, Sarah dropped her keys on the counter and headed to the kitchen to fill Max's water bowl. He lapped it up eagerly, then padded over to the couch, curling into his favorite spot. Sarah watched him for a moment, her heart swelling with gratitude. She sank into the armchair across from him, her body finally allowing itself to relax. The quiet was interrupted by the buzz of her phone. She hesitated before answering, her fatigue weighing heavily on her. It was Harris. "Sarah," he began, his tone careful, "just wanted to let you know, the victims are stable. Doctors say they'll recover." Sarah exhaled, relief washing over her. "That's good to hear. And the suspects?" she asked. Harris's voice hardened. "In custody. With the evidence we gathered, they won't see daylight for a long time." "Good," she said, her voice firm. There was a pause, then Harris spoke again. "Take the day, Collins. You both earned it." Sarah smiled faintly. "Thanks, Captain." She hung up and set the phone down, leaning back in her chair. Max had shifted in his sleep, his paws twitching slightly as though he were dreaming. She watched him, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what they'd been through and what they'd narrowly escaped. The day passed quietly. Sarah dozed on the couch while Max stayed curled in his spot, the two of them soaking in the stillness. The weight of the night began to lift, replaced by a deep sense of accomplishment. They had faced the worst, and they had made it through, together. As the sun began to set, Sarah stood and stretched, her muscles sore, but her spirit lighter. She walked over to Max and knelt beside him, stroking his fur gently. "You know, Max," she said, her voice soft, "I don't think I could do any of this without you." Max opened one eye, his tail wagging faintly. He pressed his nose against her hand, his way of saying he felt the same. The bond they shared was unspoken, forged in fire and danger, but it was unbreakable. Sarah knew there would be more storms to face, more nights filled with uncertainty and fear. But as long as Max was by her side, she could face anything. "Ready for the next one, partner?" she asked, her lips curving into a small smile. Max let out a soft huff, his tail thumping against the couch. Together they watched the sun dip below the horizon, the city lights flickering on one by one. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were home.